Hey juniors, good to see you guys, sort of, figuratively speaking. Coming at you from my house, Easter evening, Sunday, April 12th. And our household is winding down for the night, and I just decided I'd go ahead and record this really quickly and hopefully have it ready for you tomorrow at 1 o'clock. So, I have Captain America here to join in the fun and be here present with us while we have our lesson today. I have not gotten your test graded. I am slowly working through lots and lots of stuff, so be patient. I will get to everything. But since we only have 5 weeks of school left, which is absolutely crazy to me, I have decided that to hurry it along and get through as much material as I can, I have decided that I'm going to kind of hop, skip, and jump across the rest of American history by focusing on a handful of significant, I would say world-changing, American-changing presidents and events. And so, we just finished the second industrial revolution and all of the new innovations and influx of immigrants into our country, and the just kind of the changing of times. And probably the next pretty significant event, which I'm not actually going to talk about very much, is the Spanish-American War. President McKinley became president. He was the last president on our pictures that we had. He became president at the end of the 1890s, and he unfortunately was assassinated in, I think, 1901. And his vice president was a little tiny guy with spectacles from the state of New York named Theodore Roosevelt, also known as Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt his personality was much bigger than his stature, and I have brought a teddy bear to commemorate, to remind us of Teddy Roosevelt. Yes, the name Teddy bears come from Teddy Roosevelt. I asked Cheney if I could borrow this, so I'm just going to set him back over here. And we are going to talk about Teddy Roosevelt. And so during William McKinley's presidency was the Spanish-American War, and it was during that era that America began to become a empire-seeking nation, similar to how the British had been for centuries. And we began to gobble up countries and territories outside of the continental United States. And that sort of happened as a result of the Spanish-American War. We went to war against the Spanish because of some of the abuses that we saw in Cuba. And you guys know the story that the USS Maine blew up in a port down near Havana, Cuba, and Americans assumed that the Spanish had done it. The Spanish controlled or colonized the island of Cuba, and President McKinley asked for a declaration of war as a result of that. The war didn't last very long. We kind of pummeled the Spanish, and as a result of that war, America acquired several territories, such as the Philippine Islands on the other side of the globe, the Dominican Republic, Guam, and some other Spanish holdings. We did not, however, decide to acquire Cuba. We instead oversaw them, gave them sort of their independence after a while, and they allowed us to have a military presence there. That military presence is still in Cuba in spite of the many decades of problems we've had with Cuba, and it is known as Guantanamo Bay. If you know anything about the War on Terror, that is where we keep our terror combatants that are picked up on the battlefield in Afghanistan, Iraq, and around the world. We take them to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. So anyway, Teddy Roosevelt was William McKinley's vice president. When William McKinley was assassinated, Teddy Roosevelt became president. It happened right at the beginning of William McKinley's second term as president. So Teddy Roosevelt came into office, and he was a man with a plan. And so we're going to talk very briefly about him. His story is found in chapters 17 and 18 of your textbook. And full disclosure, again, it's getting kind of late, and I'm going to go through this PowerPoint fairly quickly and hit on the highlights. There are several video clips that I want you to watch. One of them, of course, is the president's video on Teddy Roosevelt, but I'm just going to go through the highlights of his presidency. As I mentioned before, he was from New York, and he was a Republican. He was a Republican in the venue of Donald Trump. Donald Trump likes to associate himself with Andrew Jackson, but I think he is much more in keeping with Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt did not believe in small government like traditional Republicans. He believed in big government, and that government should get involved, and government should regulate, and government should do what it has to for whatever is best for our country. Of course, that was in the era really before the ideas of socialism and such were popular. But he did believe in the free market system, but he felt like oftentimes big business, big industry took advantage of the consumer as well as their workers, which they did, and he intervened. And so we're going to talk about some of the things. He became president at the very beginning of what is known as the Progressive Era. And the Progressive Era started at the turn of the century, 1900, and lasted through Woodrow Wilson. So it was Roosevelt, and then William Howard Taft, and then Woodrow Wilson. So those were our three progressive presidents. The insinuation of the word progressive means that there was much progress done, forward thinking, change that took place in our country during that time, and a lot of things did change. There was a lot of government regulation of the economy that had never existed prior to this time frame. There was, just lost my train of thought. Things such as prohibition, basically criminalizing drinking and alcohol, a custom that was as old as the world or mankind, or the history of mankind, was made illegal in our country. Women finally got the right to vote during this century. People began to be taxed based upon the percentage of their income. The wealthier were taxed at a higher rate. Several things happened during this era that were considered progress. And so Teddy Roosevelt is our first progressive president. I'm going to put on my glasses here. Let's see here. The book defines the progressive era as a period of social activism and political reform in the United States that flourished from 1890 to 1920. The progressives sought several different things, but in a nutshell, the book boils it down to four things. They sought to protect the social fabric, social welfare of the American people, which meant that the government would reach in and help out when somebody needed a hand. If you were an orphan, or if you were unemployed, if you had mental illness, the government was going to try to step in and try to help you. The government was now going to be an instrument of moral standards, and so the government was going to regulate behavior such as prohibition. Also, the government was now going to create economic reform. They were going to do things to regulate the economy for the best betterment of everybody. And then lastly, progressives wanted to, what they called, foster efficiency. They wanted to set in motion systems to make our government run like a good business, which honestly, there's really nothing wrong with that, although government generally doesn't do anything very well. So let's see here. During the progressive era, these actually were passed during the Woodrow Wilson presidency, which was the last of the three progressive presidents, but they were building during Roosevelt, Taft, and then Wilson. So the 16th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified in 1913. This was the graduated income tax, which I said before. The Constitution forbids the unequal distribution of taxes, percentages of taxes. For instance, if I, as a government, want to collect a tax on Captain America action hero dolls, I cannot tax you a nickel and then Mrs. Campbell a dime because I'm older and I have more money. I can only tax one certain amount for both people, and that's actually in the Constitution. Well, what happened was the government was weary of depending on tariffs for their tax revenue, and they decided to see about introducing an income tax like had been introduced during the Civil War that would be based upon how much money somebody made. So when it was first introduced, the wealthier, those Andrew Carnegie's and Rockefellers, those sorts of people who hadn't been paying any income tax, those sorts of people would be taxed at a higher percentage. They would be taxed at, let's say, 3% of their income. But somebody who worked in the textile mill would only be taxed at 1% of their income, which sounds great on paper. Well, sure, the wealthy can pay more. Unfortunately, once it became part of the Constitution and it was an amendment to the Constitution, the government has increased that every single year. Now, I think the statistics are 45% or something like that of the American population pays no income tax because they fall below a certain threshold, and people who make a lot more money pay a higher percentage of their income. So if you make over, let's say, 100,000, you pay 28% of your income. If you make between 80 and 100,000, you pay 20% of your income to federal taxes, et cetera, et cetera. So the Constitution forbid that, and part of that was to avoid class warfare with the founding fathers. But during the Progressive era, it seemed like a good idea. And so talk to your parents about it. They probably don't like it very much. The 17th Amendment was very interesting. We began electing our senators the same way that we elect our members of the House of Representatives. If you will recall, when the Constitution was first written, the only branch of government that was directly elected by the people was the House of Representatives. The president is technically elected by the Electoral College. Senators were chosen by their state legislatures and voted there, not by the whole population of the state. Judges were appointed by the president, the federal judges were. And so this was a huge change. It made senators, state senators that were going to Washington, D.C., now national representatives, dealing with national issues. And so it was shifting away from state power to more federal power. The 18th Amendment, of course, was prohibition, which didn't last very long. And then the 19th Amendment was the women's right to vote. So finally, in 1919, the women finally got the right to vote. So 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendment all passed within a 4, 5, 6 year window of time at the end of the Progressive era. Okay, so Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt came into office at a time where manufacturing industry was not regulated by the government. And it, shall we say, I'm just going to use the meat packing industry for an example. There is a picture on your PowerPoint of a book called The Jungle, written by Upton Sinclair. And it was a book, a kind of an investigative book about the conditions within the meat factories in America, and the conditions were horrible. I'm going to actually have you read an excerpt from the book that talks about rat droppings, workers' fingers being chopped off into the meat grinders, just horrible, horrible things. It's sickening. Now today, our food industries are over-regulated probably for our good, because of the problems that existed way back then. Teddy Roosevelt, when he first read the book, he thought that it was fiction. He thought there's no way that this is true. And so he had Upton Sinclair to the White House and visited with him. And he said, if what you're saying is true, and he was going to send his own investigators in, I'm going to do something about it. And sure enough, it was true. And so thus began the regulating arm of Teddy Roosevelt, sticking his arm within private businesses and industries and fixing them for the betterment of the American people. I meant to mention this earlier, but Teddy Roosevelt probably, I would say, is very, very famous for his time serving during the Spanish-American War as Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. He personally organized a cavalry unit to go down to Cuba and fight the Spanish. At the time, he was serving as the deputy director of the United States Navy. and he gave up his position and came down here, and then went home and decided to run for governor of New York, and that's when he was selected to be VP. So there's a picture of him here on San Juan Hill with the Rough Riders in Cuba. All right, so there are some pictures of the meatpacking industry, and there talks a little bit about that. I'm also going to have you read this section in your book so you read a little bit more about that. Roosevelt, when he came to office, by default, he said he was going to give the American people a square deal. And that meant he was going to do what he could to improve the conditions on the ground for the American people, for the average person. He used the presidency as a bully pulpit. It gave him the opportunity to almost preach like a preacher, what he believed was important for the American people. One of the things he really believed in was regulation. Donald Trump, however, is not a regulator, so he removes regulation, and so that way they are not the same. Another thing that Roosevelt went after was trusts. And trusts were large corporate entities that were kind of imaginary. They were companies on paper only that merged together to create these legal entities to protect the money of the captains of industry and the robber barons. And he began to go after them and said that they had gotten too big for their own britches, and that these large companies were actually harmful to the free market and to competition within the free market. And so if there is no competition in a free market system, the consumers end up getting the bad end of the deal. And so he went after businesses and tried to break up trust. He was called a trust buster. He also went after the railroads. There's several different things here that are mentioned. The first time in American history where the federal government tried to regulate the economy was a law, or a law passed by Congress called the Interstate Commerce Commission. And essentially Congress put together a commission to oversee the railroad. Didn't really have much power to do anything, but it was kind of an initial step. And then when Roosevelt became president, he signed into law, find my spot here, the Elkins Act of 1903, which made it illegal for railroad officials to give and shippers to receive rebates for using particular railroads, basically bribes. And then also the Elkins Act basically said that railroads could not change, got a typo here, set rates without notifying the public. So oftentimes what would happen, it would be like if you were to buy a plane ticket. Say you want to go to New York City sometime in the future, and it's a $500 a round trip ticket. And then when you went to the airport that day, you went to get your ticket, and the person at the counter said, "Oh, I'm sorry, sir, those tickets are now $700. Well, you would have a fit, because when you purchased it 6 weeks earlier, the price was $500, and there were times in our history where companies had the power to do that. They could change the price, and so the Elkins Act forbid that railroad companies from doing that. The Hepburn Act was also passed during his era. This limited the distribution of free railroad passes, which again was a form of bribery. The railroads would hand out these free passes to members of Congress, judges, members of the law, and it was considered a form of bribery so that they would vote for however the railroad wanted them to vote. And it also gave power to the government to set maximum railroad rates, but I believe that the Supreme Court ruled that unconstitutional. Let's see here. It's all kind of boring. Another industry that Roosevelt went after was the food and drug industry. We already mentioned the meatpacking industry, but also the false advertising that existed on primarily medicinal products, like the one I have here is stomach troubles. Take this product and your stomach troubles will vanish like magic. And you might be consuming baking soda. It just was all fake advertisement, which lured people to buy things that weren't. They really didn't perform what they said they performed, and so the Pure Food and Drug Act required drug companies they could not put false labeling on there. They couldn't say something was something when it was not. It didn't require them to put every thing that was in the product on the label, but they couldn't lie about what was in it, if that makes sense. And then, of course, Teddy Roosevelt is extremely famous for his conservation measures. He saved millions of acres of forest as people were moving out west. He was convinced by John Muir and some other conservationists that there were elements of our wilderness that were our national treasures, and we needed to preserve them and not allow homesteaders and others to gobble up that land, or the railroad, or whoever. And so Roosevelt was an outdoorsman, always had been. He had asthma as a young child, and so he had really determined in his life that he wasn't going to let it beat him. And so he was a huge hunter, fisherman, hiker. In fact, the day he discovered that President McKinley had been shot, he and his family were hiking the mountains in New York State. Then he had to come back to Washington, D.C. from his hike. So he also reserved a lot of land for future water projects that would redirect water to some of the barren places out west in California and otherwise. He saved 50 different wildlife sanctuaries and national parks. And he also basically stamped a seal on many of the western lands that said, these are federal lands. It's not open for any settlement. And that was really, really important because, as my son could attest to, I don't know if you've been to Yosemite National Park or Yellowstone National Park, those sorts of parks, although I think Yellowstone was already nationalized at that point. I'm so thankful that he had the foreknowledge to set aside some of those lands and protect them from being commercialized. So Teddy Roosevelt, big conservationist. He wasn't... I've heard mixed reviews about his position on civil rights. Outwardly, he went through the motions of courting elements of the civil rights movement. He had Booker T. Washington to the White House several times to advise him, but he did not, that this was not an area of reform that he felt comfortable in. It's said that his father was very open to, but his mother was a little bit racist, and so some of those things kind of bled into him. There's some pictures on here of him and Booker T. Washington at the White House. Okay, and then real quick, I'm going to switch to him as a world leader. He had a huge footprint on the world stage. Basically, don't mess with America. He introduced the idea of the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And if you will remember, the Monroe Doctrine said that all Europe needs to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. It's not open for colonization anymore. Teddy Roosevelt took that a step further with his corollary and said, not only are we not open for colonization, but we are the Western Hemisphere's police force. We will police the Western Hemisphere, and we will do what is best for America. And to him, that meant to introduce and encourage democracy, but also to use the Great White Fleet, as he called our Navy. He built up our Navy and sailed it all around the Western Hemisphere and said, if you mess with us, we will mess with you. And he used the strength and power and the manipulation of the U.S. Navy also to get some things that he wanted as well. So let's see here. He acted as a peacekeeper between warring and struggling powers. There was one incident where Russia and Japan were basically at war, and Roosevelt had them to the White House and negotiated a peace. Of course, the Panama Canal was Teddy Roosevelt's baby. He's like, we need a canal. We got to stop sailing around South America. And so he did a little political maneuvering. Panama at the time was owned by the South American country of Colombia, and he told them that he wanted it. He wanted to use it as it was the best place to build a canal, closest between the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean, and Colombia said no. And he said, well, I'm going to take it anyway. And so he sent our Navy down there to blockade any efforts they had to intervene. And there was a coup in Panama supported by the American government, an anti-Colombia coup. And we supported the new government, and we set up began construction of the Panama Canal. There are pictures of the Panama Canal here. Essentially, canals are man-made waterways, and where the Panama Canal is located in Central America is a narrow distance between, like I said, those two waterways, but also there's lots of natural lakes, and it was the best place to build it. So went to work doing that, and there is actually a time-lapse video that I want you to watch. Hey, chap. Good night. See ya. Love you too. So I want you to watch that. And let's see here. There's some cool pictures of the construction going on. Pictures of Roosevelt the conservationist. And then finally, after almost 8 years as president, because he became president early on in McKinley's second term, he decided he wasn't going to run for president again. He was going to observe President Washington's 2-term limit. Even though he technically didn't serve a full 2 terms, he was going to pass the baton to his very good friend William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft is the big gentleman that got stuck in the bathtub, famously known for that. And he handpicks him. He supports him as the Republican nominee for president. And Howard Taft wasn't crazy about being president. He actually wanted to be a chief justice or a justice on the Supreme Court. He was a progressive also, and so he decided to go ahead and do it hands down. And over the course of those 4 years while Taft was president, Teddy Roosevelt was like, I think I might want to be president again. I think this was a wrong decision. And so he decides that he's going to go after Taft and criticize him publicly. It's almost like he had like a late midlife crisis where he threw a temper tantrum because he wasn't in control anymore. I don't know what happened, but he sort of muddied his legacy a little bit for me anyway. And he decided, as the next presidential election rolled around at the end of Taft's 4 years, that he was going to run against him. And he couldn't get the Republican nomination. The convention would not give him the nomination. And so he decided to run as a third-party candidate, famously the Bull Moose Party. It was during his campaigning that he was actually shot by a would-be assassin. They say he continued to give his speech for several minutes or close to an hour after he was shot. I believe I read somewhere that he had a copy of his speech in his vest. It was really, really thick. It was like in a notebook, and it impeded the full damage of the bullet. But he was injured. But he continued to give the speech. But he got a lot of votes. But what he ended up doing was he stole enough votes away from President Taft that the Democratic candidate, Woodrow Wilson, ended up winning with a pretty small majority. So he split the Republican ticket and lost the election for the Republicans because of his, I'm going to say pride. I don't know for sure if that's what it was. But and after that, he decided to... he continued his conservation efforts, and he traveled the world hunting. He went to Africa, he went to South America, he did the Amazon forest. He got very, very ill on that particular trip with his son. He continued to have health issues related to, I think, his asthma. As World War I approached, his, I believe, youngest son was killed. He was a pilot, and he was killed in... what I've read was he was just completely emotionally devastated from that. And ultimately, he quietly slipped into eternity. And I believe he was just a little over 60 years old. He lived life to the fullest. He lived it loud and big. And he quietly slipped into eternity, is what his son said. Without much noise. Interesting. He didn't have any long illness or anything. He just passed away. So anyway, I'm sure there's other things that I have left out, but I wanted to make this a little bit shorter than normal. There is a worksheet associated with this reading assignment that I want you to complete. It's actually, I'll put it on Google Docs and you'll just submit it. So after you're finished listening to this, I'd like you to read through the section that I just reviewed, and then I'd like for you to answer those questions and submit them. And so that is your marching orders from me. And I will tell you, I'm going to call it a pop quiz, but on Wednesday, you will have a quiz at the beginning of the class period. It will be a Google Doc that will be sort of timed, related to this lesson, and the assignment that you're going to work on during this class period. So make sure that you review that before you start class on Wednesday so that you are prepared to take a pop quiz. Okay? All right, I think that's all for now. I'm sure I'll think of something else, but follow the instructions in the PowerPoint and watch the videos that you're supposed to watch. There's a president's video on Teddy Roosevelt as well. And I hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your day, and keep looking in RunWeb for those grades to come in. I'm getting through them slowly but surely, so I appreciate you guys, and I'll see you later. Bye.